In this lesson, we're going to be setting up our own testing server using a GitHub repository. So creating a db.json file, and this is the contents of my testing one where we're just loading in post information. So we're getting all of the posts from the endpoint, and we're iterating through all of the posts. We can simulate that and load that. So if we want post number 1, we can also see post number 2. So we can simulate getting back the post data from the endpoint. And this is all done through the myJSON server type code. So you need to have a GitHub account in order to do this, and then make sure that you've got some valid JSON data that you've got within your DB JSON database. And then you can use that as an endpoint and connect to it. And in this case, what we're doing is we're just doing a simple request and loading the contents. There's also options to connect using get, post, put, patch, and delete. So these changes aren't going to be persistent. Your data within the db.json is not going to change, but you will get a response from the endpoint. So it's an excellent way to simulate working with server data and JSON data within your application. Opening up the editor, we've created the index.html file that's got the standard divs that we've been using in the previous lessons, and we're linking it to code6.js. Within code6.js, selecting the elements from the page, adding in the event listener, so whenever the button gets clicked, we get the ready message within the console. And then I've also kept in the function to add elements to the page. So this gives us an easy way to create elements and append them to the page. And I'm just going to make an update to this to be appending it to the page instead of prepending it, as we're going to be adding content to the page when we're making connections to the endpoint. So this lesson is also going to be how you can set up your own endpoint. So going over to JSON placeholder.typecode.com, so that's the endpoint that we've been working with in the previous couple lessons. There's also an option to set up a myJSON server. So within the myJSON server, you can set a JSON server and have your own file running on the server. And this is how you can structure the file. So what you do is you create a file called db.json and get the repo and the user information. So get all of that, and that way you can run the repo and get the server information directly from this endpoint. So let's go ahead and copy the base URL, and then we'll update this to match the endpoint that we're going to be creating. So for the base URL, and it's going to require the user and the repo. So that is what we're going to be updating. And we need to create that, and creating that with a Git repository. So it does give you the brief examples of create a repository on GitHub. So you do need to have a GitHub account, create a db.json file, and then you can update and access your own server. And this is directly coming from GitHub. So this is a quick and easy way to set up a JSON server that you can interact with and have some data that you can access online. So I'm going to go over to GitHub, log into my GitHub account, create a new repository. So give the repository a name, testing database, and just leave it open to the public. You don't have to add a README file. You can if you want. And within the repository, so this is going to be our testing database repository in GitHub, and we can add files to it as well. So let's go ahead and create a brand new file. And according to the instructions, we got to give this file a file name of db.json. And then within the db.json, we can set up the JSON information. And actually, let's extend on this. So adding in additional parameters. So if we want maybe body to that, testing. And you can, of course, add whatever content you want, as long as it's properly structured within a JSON structure. So let's update, and we'll add a few more posts. So this can have an ID of 2, it can have hello 2 and testing 2. And let's do one more where we've got 3, and this will just say hello 3 and testing 3. So once you've created your JSON database file, so you're going to be connecting to this using the JSON, the MyJSON server. So commit the file, and that will create the file within the repository. And typically you will, and you should include a README file. So what I'll do is I'll just set up and I'll just copy within the README file the instructions on how to. So I'll add that file as well to the repository. So within this testing database repository, we've got just the DB JSON. And then this is going to be the path that we need to connect to. So that includes the user and the repo that we want to use. And just make sure that we get it correct. So the user and then the repo that we want to use, and then / that, and we can select all of the content that's currently within that repo. And using the same structure that they have here, we're going to connect to it and get all of the post information. So do posts, and that should return back all of the posts data. And then instead of loading the data, let's make the fetch request. And we'll just make the fetch request actually to the base URL. So that's the initial fetch request to the base URL, or for consistency, we can create a URL object, and that will give us the structure in order to update the URL path. So make a connection, then return back the response object, and take the response object and send it to the next promise with as JSON data. And then lastly, we get the data that's being returned back, and we're going to output that contents of the data into the console. So I hadn't included that, that's why we're throwing an error there. And it looks like I'm still getting an error, so that means that the syntax, the JSON syntax, is incorrect, and that's the error response that we're getting. So let's double check and make sure that our syntax is correct, so you can use that within a linting application. So let's open up the JSON lint and paste and do a validate JSON. So it immediately caught the parsing error. So the problem was that it wasn't valid JSON data, so I had left in that extra comma, so that can throw things off. So make the change, commit the change. And now I've got a valid JSON object. And that's also another thing that you can do as well. Just make sure that when you do construct the JSON object, that it is valid JSON, and you can double check it with the JSON lint tool. So let's refresh and click it. And also, if we were to place the URL, we see that we do have that error here. So with Git, it does take a few minutes usually just to do a refresh. And once it reloads the output data, so once you can see it within the web browser, you should also be able to load it within your web application. And then from here, you can take the content that you've got on Git and do something with it. So we'll create some quick loading of the content. So it's already within an array, the data array. So create page, and creating a function in order to handle the create page. So take in the data, JSON data object, and first thing we'll do is we'll output and inner HTML, so we'll clear out the existing page content within output, and take data, going through each item within data, and that's selecting each one of the elements. So the structure is body, ID, and title. So creating a main object, and then we'll drop the rest of them into main. So structure for adding the element is whatever the parent is. So we use output. The type of element is going to be a div, and the contents are just going to be blank for this one, as this is our main parent. So that adds that to the page. Let's also add one for the title, and using the same structure, we can add to the main object and adding in a div and selecting the content, and that's going to be contained within the data. So that's just data title. And if we're not using or applying any styling to the element, we can even shorten it by that. We don't need the callback element object, so we're not going to be making use of it. And this is just a simple demonstration. So we've got the body contents, and then also let's add one more element, and this can be whatever the ID is. And for main itself, using class list, let's add a class, and I'll just add a quick styling box to it. Let's create the box element and set the width, and also adding in a border. Margin, and so the margin for top and bottom can be 10 pixels, and auto. And also let's add some padding and update the font size. So there we go. So let's click it and see what we get for output. And it's not actually passing over to create page, and actually this should be element instead of data. So that was the problem there, was using the wrong object value. So make an update to that, and this time it should work. Where we're outputting the content that's actually sitting within our GitHub data object. So this is a quick and easy way that you can create an endpoint with your own data, and it's a fake endpoint, so you can interact with it. And you can find out more information about the JSON type code. So you can use get, post, put, patch, delete. The changes aren't persistent between calls. So it's just like what we saw last time, where we can, within the last lesson, where we can make the requests, but they're not persistent between calls. So just keep that in mind, that this is just a testing database, and the only one that's going to work is that get request, where you're actually making a request and getting the contents back from the JSON data. And I'll also update the input value, and I'll set that to display, and just update the style to display, and we'll hide that input as we don't need to interact with it. And also for the button, let's update the text content for the button, and load GitHub JSON data. And see how that looks. So that gives us the ability to load the data. Tasks for this lesson are to create a repo on GitHub, and then add to that repo a db.json file, create some custom JSON, and add that into the db.json file, and then using JavaScript, connect to that endpoint on the myjson.server type code, and select the content using JavaScript fetch, return it back as a JSON object, make some requests to the endpoint, return the data onto the web page, and then output the contents of the data that's sitting on GitHub and output it within your web page elements.